Someone here for WynnStrength.com. On this video, I'll talk about my favorite deadlift accessory movement, the pause deadlift. Sorry. So I've recently achieved a 515-pound deadlift. That's my latest training PR. I set that a couple of weeks ago. Pretty proud of that. And one of the favorite deadlift accessory movements that I personally like is the pause deadlift. I think they're a great way to add some more variety into your training whilst keeping the deadlift accessory movement very, very specific. We're not really changing anything other than placing pause in there. I think out of all the deadlift accessory movements you can do, this should be at the top of your list, especially if you're still within that 515-pound range. If you're still trying to shoot for 5 plates, a 5-plate deadlift, I would highly recommend this as an accessory lift, just because that's helped me personally. And based on that single piece of evidence, I would say that it's one of the better accessory lifts out there, just because it has worked well for me. Now, it might not work well for you. There might be other lifts that you prefer, such as a deficit, a block pull, tempo deadlifts, other varieties like that. But we'll talk about the pause deadlift today just because it is my personal favorite. So just like any movement, we can't just keep doing that same movement over and over again. There's going to be a point where we hit diminishing marginal returns. And the more we do that movement, the less effective it becomes. Not just from like a physical standpoint, which it is there, but from the lesser known, like less thought about aspect would be the mental aspect. So if you told me all I could ever do was deadlift conventionally the same exact way with the same exact reps for 1 year, you're probably going to cause some people to not exercise at all, just because it is that's just very, very, very boring, to be honest with you. And most training programs won't do that because not only is it boring, but it's not that effective. So we need to add in extra accessory lifts in order to supplement the main movement. So just like a deadlift, we need to throw in another deadlift session over the course of the week if that's what we want to improve. But it can't be the same deadlift that we've been doing previously, because now we're going to be deadlifting the same way 2 times in a week. And because of that diminishing marginal returns concept, as well as mental staleness and boredom, we kind of want to throw in an extra variety of movement there. And that's where the pause deadlift comes in, because the more specific we are to a movement, the more carryover we're going to get to that movement that we're trying to train up. So for example, we're obviously working on that conventional deadlift. If you were doing, say, a sumo deadlift, that conventional deadlift won't have as much carryover to a sumo deadlift as a sumo deadlift varietal. So we can talk about pause deadlifts, we can talk about conventional or sumo deadlifts, and you'll be doing the same exact thing, but in your specific deadlift setup. The same thing could be said for if we wanted to do, say, snatch grip deadlifts. While yes, great for Olympic movements and snatches, if you're only ever going to compete in a powerlifting competition where the snatch deadlift isn't the chosen movement, then you're going to have slightly less carryover to the conventional deadlift. So as we divert away from the movement pattern that we want to do, the less carryover we're going to have to that exact movement. So for example, we could do hip thrusts where the barbell's across our hips and we're thrusting up in order to drive up some gains in the glutes, I guess. But how that is going to carry over to the deadlift is questionable. Yes, we're still activating the same muscle groups, but now we're training a whole different movement pattern. And based on and depending on your goals and the situation you were at in your training cycle, throwing in some hip thrusts might not be efficient or effective for you if you're really trying to work up that conventional deadlift. Yes, it'll probably throw in some hypertrophy and some volume as well as obviously eliciting some strength gains in the glutes. But if you're really trying to train for that specific movement, there might be better movement options that are a bit more effective and a bit more efficient, that are better use of your time in training. So this brings me back to the pause deadlift. It is pretty much a regular deadlift as you would normally execute it, except you're pausing at any point below the knee. Generally, I like to do a pause below the knee. You can literally pause anywhere from the ground to lockout. for the most part, below the knees where a lot of people have struggles, and that's generally where it's going to be the hardest part of the movement. Once you get that weight past the knees, for the most part, it's going to be able to be locked out. You're going to be able to fight through that. For the most part, there's always going to be that exception to the rule, and obviously we've all dropped deadlifts from above the knee. But when we're trying to look at how we can put in the vast generalization, pausing below the knee is going to be the most blanket case place to put it, and placing it at about an inch off the floor is going to help a lot, because we're going to throw that focus on the start of the deadlift, where starting that deadlift from the dead stop is going to be probably the hardest part. You're going to budge, and you're going to get to that point where you can either move the bar or you can't, and sometimes it might come down to strength, sometimes it might come down to technique. And when we train the pause deadlift, we're really focusing on trying to make sure that technique is the exact same way as it is when you perform a regular deadlift without a pause. So ideally, when you pause in that pause deadlift, it should look like at the start of the video, where you hit pause on a video player and you don't move. If you're moving in any way whatsoever, then you're defeating the purpose of the pause deadlift, and you're not executing the pause deadlift in the way that it should be executed. The movement pattern should look identical, and that brings me to the second point as to why I think it's a great accessory lift, is that the technique, it's going to ingrain the technique into you, because you're effectively repeating the same technique, except it's taking you longer to do that. So you're training your body to hold certain positions for a longer time, so that you're getting some muscle memory in that specific point. And you have to be really careful here, because there is the opportunity for you to overdo this and shift the focus away from technical aptitude and just lifting some heavy weights, where you start to divert from maintaining that picture perfect technique, and now we're just trying to do the movement just to lift the most weight that's possible. And yes, we're always wanting to lift the most weight possible, but when we think of the reasons as to why we're doing the pause deadlift, which should be to help supplement the regular deadlift, then the weight on the bar doesn't matter as much as the technique is executed. No one cares how much you can pause deadlift, they all care about how much you can regular deadlift. So try not to forget about that when you execute the pause deadlift, just because when we start forgetting about the why and we start loosening that technique, then we start to ingrain bad motor patterns into our regular deadlift. Because we are practicing the same movement, our body's going to learn that pattern. So we need to make sure that we focus on all the key fundamentals of a regular deadlift. It should start off like a regular deadlift, and when that pause happens, you should maintain tightness in all the key areas. You're wanting to make sure that barbell doesn't drift away from the shins, it stays in contact with your legs the whole time. You're still engaging the lats, your armpits are still pushing down towards your back pockets. Your balance is going to be key here. If you feel yourself starting to drift forward, again, shift to technique, you need to address that. If you're starting to lean far back so you can hold the weight there, again, not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to maintain that angle where you're finding difficulty in the deadlift. So when we pause here, we don't want to make the lift mechanically easier by allowing us to lean back, and that'll allow us to rest the barbell on our legs and like kind of use it as a seesaw. That's not the point of the pause, because we're trying to train the body to maintain tension in this angle, not this angle, because we don't ever want to be in this angle for a regular deadlift. And this is where filming yourself, or at least filming yourself, if not having a coach or someone else that'll look at your form, this is where that becomes key, because in the moment it's going to feel like you're not moving, you're not doing anything. But when you re-watch yourself, or you have someone else watch you, they can point out and you'll be able to see exactly if you are moving or if you're not moving, and where those breakdowns in form are happening. And I think that's one of the key things to the pause deadlift is don't just perform the pause deadlift, much like all your other lifts. Record them and then analyze them afterwards, so that you can make sure that the technique is staying the same and all the angles are all lined up and you're not drifting away from that. And if you are, you need to address that earlier rather than later, so that those movement patterns don't get ingrained in your body during the regular deadlift. So this brings me to my next point, where I think the pause deadlift really help you with your pull from the floor, the initial start of the deadlift, because we're training you to squeeze the bar off the floor by removing any momentum that you might want to derive by kind of aggressively jerking the bar up. I'm from the camp that I believe you should squeeze the bar up rather than jerking the bar off the floor. You know what I'm talking about. When you watch some people deadlift, they kind of like get the bar and then you see them almost trying to sprint, kind of jump the weight up. So they're trying to get some momentum before the bottom of the pull and then pull up, yanking the barbell off of the floor. I'm not a big fan of that technique. I much prefer to see you squeeze the barbell off the floor. So the barbell in essence becomes heavy in the hand. If that makes any sense, when you do it slowly, you'll kind of understand what I mean. You're gonna squeeze as much tension as possible, and then that's gonna start driving the weight up off the floor. Yes, you're gonna be aggressive. Yes, you're trying to lift that fast, but you're not trying to jerk the bar off the floor. It's a huge difference here. And what the pause deadlift is gonna do is train you to not jerk the bar off the floor, because you're gonna have to stop either an inch or like just below the knees. So you can't, if you're trying to stop at a certain point, you know you shouldn't accelerate past that. You're gonna have to stop at a certain point. And that stopping is going to remove that tendency you might have to violently jerk the bar off the floor and yank that weight up. So it's going to help ingrain that motor pattern into you as well. And by pausing just above the floor, it's also going to help with some of that time under tension at the point where it really matters, is right off of the floor. The next point will be kind of programming and stress and load management. I think the pause deadlift is probably one of the better first movements you could do, followed by the deficit deadlift. Basically, when you get to the point in your training where you need to introduce a second deadlift session over the course of the week, so this will probably be like for intermediate type training, you probably don't need to do any variance when you're first starting off. So the first month of training, you really should focus on the basic main lifts and don't really deviate from that, just so you get that mental practice as well as that coordination and skill development. But once you hit that point where we need to add in that extra session, I think this is a great opportunity to add in a pause deadlift, because with the stress management piece in mind, we're not going to be able to use as much weight, obviously. So if you can pull 500, you're probably going to be pausing high 3s to low 400 pounds. So that's a huge difference in weight, but the difficulty is still going to be there. It's still going to feel really, really difficult and really hard. You can get to an RPE 10 with a pause deadlift, I assure you that. But the overall stress load on the body is going to be a lot less because we're using a lot lighter weight. So it's a way to mitigate that stress and manage fatigue over the course of a week without having to go hard all the time. We're able to still go hard, but with lesser weights, so that we're mechanically disadvantaged in that lift, meaning that we can still stress the body quite a lot, but without having to tax the body too much. So there is kind of that slight difference there. We're still wanting to introduce stress, obviously, but we can't introduce too much stress all the time, otherwise we won't be able to recover from that stress. And because we are exposing the body to a very similar version of the deadlift, we're still also getting that practice that I talked about before. So we're not only able to stress the body weight-wise and exposure to heavy-ish weights, we're also able to expose the body to technique execution. So we're getting more practice at the lift in almost the same fashion as the regular deadlift. And all we're doing is adding that pause there. So again, as I said, everything should look the same. So you're getting that good technique kind of driven into the body, into the muscle, so that it knows how to execute that at a later date. And the final point will be time under tension. I think obviously we're going to increase the duration of how long the deadlift is going to take because we're pausing, so it's not going to be as quick as a regular deadlift. All other factors the same. And what this does is it does a couple of things. It helps build some more time under tension for the muscle group, so you're able to put in a little bit more hypertrophy into the ancillary and stabilizing muscles for a deadlift, and that should be right where your weakness is. So ideally you pick a point where you're weak. If we're starting right off the floor, an inch off the floor, that's generally one of the mechanically weaker points of the deadlift. So when we do that, we're strengthening the spinal erectors, the hamstrings, right at the start of the pull, so we're able to get a bit more volume and a bit more targeted hypertrophy in that section without having to overstress the rest of the body. And the next thing this increased time will help by building those muscles and whatnot is because the pull is taking longer, when our deadlifts start to get heavy and the speed at which we can deadlift slows down, just because a 600-pound deadlift will be slower than a 300-pound deadlift. Just because we're lifting heavy, it's going to look a lot slower, it's going to feel a little heavier. So what it's going to do is going to teach us how to stay braced, how to stay tight, and maintain tension in the entire body throughout a longer time frame. So at the very least, just say you can pull a deadlift in a second. We're going to add 2 seconds there. So now the pause deadlift takes 3 seconds total. If when you're struggling with a heavy weight and you reach that second, your body is going to be used to you staying tense for at least 3 seconds. So you're going to have a little bit of help in maintaining tension and bracing in the rest of the body because of the extra time that it took for the pause. And finally, it'll help with grip training. Provided you use double overhand grip and no lifting straps, the pause should really help maintain the grip, just because we're, again, increasing the length of the pull. So now we're holding a barbell for 3 seconds instead of 1 with a heavy weight. We're going to add that up over the course of the week. So we're getting a lot of extra grip training here for free, almost. So how do you do a pause deadlift? It's really simple. You set up exactly like you would a regular deadlift, and that can be either conventional, sumo, or whatever type of deadlift you like to do. Set up exactly the same way, start exactly the same way. Everything should obviously be exactly the same. And all you need to do is pause at anywhere in that deadlift and you'll be good. That's really it. Couple of pointers, obviously. A common place to pause is 1 inch right off the ground. That's going to help you with starting off the floor, just because you are so close to that starting position, and that's a really tough spot to hold, because it's one of the, short of being on the floor, it's one of the hardest positions to hold mechanically, because your center of gravity and whatnot is fighting to pull you forward, and this is really going to teach you to hold in that position and drive some more muscle growth in that position. But another way to look at it, I mentioned it earlier, is that if you have footage of yourself deadlifting, or you know where your sticking points are, put that pause just below where your normal sticking points are. So if you stick at, just say you stick right below the knee, put that pause in there 1 inch below that sticking point. So 2 inches below the knee, that's where you're going to want to pause. And again, definitely for the first couple of weeks at least, even later on, every now and then I like to place an iPad or an iPhone or a watch in front of me and put the stopwatch on there, so that when I pause, I know that that's a true 2 seconds. Because one thing that has become apparent to me is that pause deadlift is the one way we figured out how to stop time. For some reason, 2 seconds pausing feels like 10 seconds, and when I think I've paused for 2 seconds and I look at the replay, it's definitely not 2 seconds. So at least for the very start of when you start doing some pause deadlifts, throw in a watch somewhere that you can see in real time, and use that so that you can really feel what a true 2 second pause feels like, because counting to 2 is a lot different to waiting for 2 seconds to pass by. And that brings me to the next point, is when we are pausing, make sure that you're staying consistent with the pause time as well as the pause location. Now obviously I would say vary that up depending on your goals, but don't vary it up unknowingly. So if I want to target 1 inch off the floor for 2 seconds this week, I want to make sure that I'm not drifting that weight higher up, because it's slightly easier to pick that weight up 2 inches rather than 1 inch and hold that for a second rather than 2 seconds. And these little drifts, because they're so minute, we're talking about 1 inch and 2 inches when you're picking up a weight that's relatively heavy. When we start introducing these minute differences, that's when we're going to start to see some different outcomes, and not poor outcomes, just that they weren't the outcomes that we were expecting. So when we start drifting that weight up, we're not getting that muscle tension in the spot that we want, because maybe next week we want to add in the 2 inch pause, and then the week after that maybe the pause just below the kneecaps. So we want to open up the variability, but we can't open up the variability if we're always varying the position of the deadlift pause or the time for the deadlift pause. I obviously don't think you need to do a minute pause, but maybe you want to do a second, 2 seconds, maybe a 5 second pause. Maybe down the line you want to play around with 10 second pause and see how that helps you. But by purposefully varying it, that's fine. It's when you unwittingly change the variables, I think, is a mistake that you need to correct and need to make sure that you're trying to do everything you can to not have those creep into your training. Because much like how squat depth can change week to week, if you're thinking that you can squat 500 at a certain height and you cut that shy by 2 inches and you were able to increase that squat by 20 pounds, they weren't the same squat, so you can't compare them. So much like this, we need to have a comparison week to week so that we can keep track of progress and make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. And just like the regular deadlift, when we do that Valsalva movement, we want to make sure that we're not exhaling anywhere during the deadlift. So if we're talking about a 2-second pause, everyone should be able to hold their breath for at least 5 seconds. Worst case scenario, you should be able to hold your breath for 10 seconds while doing a regular deadlift. And I think most people are capable of that, especially if you're at the level where we're kind of talking about it. You've trained for a couple of years, your cardiovascular system should have some sort of adaptation that allows you to hold your breath for 10 seconds at least. Because what you want to do is, again, we're trying to teach the body a certain way of moving, and we're trying to train it to move and interact and coordinate itself in a certain way. So if we hold the breath during the pause, we're teaching it to maintain that tension, maintain that Valsalva, maintain that pressure in the body, so that when we drive through, we're not trying to reset that pressure. And you're never going to be able to get, if you do exhale during that pause, the intra-abdominal pressure, all that bracing you set yourself up for at the start of the deadlift is going to be nowhere near what it is at the start. So if you try and reset halfway, not going to be the same, and you're kind of you're training at a disadvantage. So definitely work on not exhaling at any point until that barbell is set down, or at the very least when you're standing up tall and everything's locked out, maybe you can have a deep breath, a quick reuptake of oxygen, or exhale and then lower the weight down as quickly as possible. But make sure you keep that breath and keep that pressure in the body while you're performing the lift. What weight should you start off at? I think if you're starting off, start off really light. Start off 50% of your rep max for that rep, whatever it is. So if you're only going to do singles, 50% of your 1 rep singles. If you're going to do 8s, 50% of whatever you can do conventionally for 8 reps. And then first couple of weeks, you just want to, obviously like anything else, you want to progress up till you get to the point where you're pushing up E8s and 9s, and you'll probably be able to hit a point where you're like 80% of the regular deadlift. Now you're never going to be able to do 100% of your regular deadlift, just because you're adding difficulty. And if you are, then that means your regular deadlift is there's something wrong and you should speak to a coach. But obviously there's going to be this trailing factor. As your regular deadlift goes up, your pause deadlift should go up along with it, but it will never catch up to it. So don't be disheartened. Obviously it shouldn't be stronger than your regular deadlift, but I would say start off really light. Once you get that pattern down, then start adding weight. And then once you figure out timing, pausing, once you're really comfortable with the movement, maybe in a couple of weeks, 2 weeks, start throwing it, start testing what you can do. If you start dropping if the weight starts lowering on the way up, then you're obviously at a too heavy weight. If you start changing things unwittingly, pauses are not the same. You start to hover where the weight is on the pause, use changing locations of the pause without wanting to. Then back the weight down and reset and reassess. And when we add in reps above 8, really reps above 5, the pause deadlift are really, really brutal. Highly recommend hating them a lot, but doing them. So you've got the handle on the regular pause deadlift. You're thinking, how can I make this more difficult? Here are a couple of tips that I would throw out there as to how you can make the pause deadlift a bit more difficult. First one being the double pause deadlift. So pause twice on the way up. Simple as that. I wouldn't personally pause on the way down. I don't think there's any advantage in that, because you're really wanting to train the concentric movement of the lift. You're not really worried about the eccentric side of the deadlift, so don't worry about the downward pause. Just pick 2 spots on the way up and you should be good. Again, 2 seconds, keep them the same, just like the regular pause deadlift. That's gonna really suck too, because now you've turned a 1 second movement into maybe a 6 second movement, because you have 2 2-second pauses. The second variety would be the halted deadlift. So we bring the weight up to where we want to pause, hold that for 2 seconds, then drop down to the bottom, and then to perform a full deadlift. So you're almost performing a 1.25 deadlift every rep. So you pick the weight up, pause, drop it, and then stand back up again. So you're doing this double 1.5 take deadlift every single time, and that's going to help just stress that point that you want to stress extra, so you're able to drive a bit more stress into the lower part of the deadlift, which should help you if you're having problems below the knee. And probably my preferred advanced deadlift method would be the deficit pause deadlift. So what we want to do here is, say, put a 2-inch deficit, and then we want to try and we want to pause where we would normally have the floor. So if you can mark it on your shins or figure out where the barbell touches your shins on the floor, you create that deficit, so stand on a bumper plate, and then make sure that your pause is where the shin would normally be when you're standing off of the floor like regular. And what this does is it trains you to hover at the floor position, which isn't normal because obviously the floor is always there generally for the regular deadlift, but now we're training a pause position. We're extending that range of motion as well as pausing where we would normally not have to pause and not have to pull through. So what we're doing really here is training the body to push through that sticking point of the floor. So now the floor isn't the starting point, it's like we're rubber banding back and then blowing through the deadlift. So hopefully that transfers through to a better start and a better initiation of that pull. So when should you do the pause deadlift? I think they're a great first option, obviously, for intermediate lifters. I think definitely if you have problems off of the floor, or if you have any sticking points below the knee, I think this is a great tool to use to address those sticking points and add in that extra muscle growth and muscle development in around that area where the sticking points tend to occur. And when shouldn't you do them? I think you don't need to do them if you have no problem pulling the weight off the floor. If the initial pull off the floor is one of your strong suits and you're always able to drive that weight up, I don't think there's a need for you to do a pause deadlift. If you have problems past the knee and up, you're generally going to have a problem with locking out the deadlift, and that's going to need a different tool, and that's probably where a rack pull or a block pull is going to serve you better, because you clearly don't need any more help generating power off of the floor or generating power in that compromised position. Once you're at that top, we're talking about different leverages now, and you need a different tool to address those weaknesses. So I wouldn't bother with a pause deadlift or even a deficit deadlift at that point. Really, if you're having a problem up off the past the knees, you really need to hammer down on some rack pulls and block pulls, just because that's where your weakness lies. So that's the ins and outs of the pause deadlift. I hope that'll help you with your training and finding a way to plug that into your program, or including that in your program if it's something that you might need some help with, getting that speed off of the floor or getting that strength off the floor or some sticking point below the knee. Leave a comment below if you use the pause deadlift or what's your favorite deadlift accessory lift. This has been Selling from WynnStrength, and remember, a better life through strength.